from control. Now I think the credibility comes from the conversation.
Yeah, I don't think you can control it, Bob.
No, that's over.
I mean, if you let me give you a specific example of a company
Please,
that didn't do a good job of controlling the PR or the news cycle.
Definitely, let's hear it.
Last year, Sony had a battery problem, the laptop battery problem. It took them a month to come out and say, well, this is the problem, and here's what we're doing about it. So for, I think it was 3 weeks, 3.5 weeks, something like that, they let the news cycle dictate, how they were going about fighting fires, and that one of the things I think that was important about Sony's kind of dealing with this was they never really came out with their top execs.
No.
Where was Howard Stringer? Where was Dr. Chubachi?
Right.
They trotted out the guys who were actually doing, the nuts and bolts work, which is admirable, I guess, because you really get the substantial answers. But you also want to see the top exec coming out and saying, this is a serious problem. And it was a serious problem.
Right.
We had millions of batteries out there that needed to be exchanged.
There was a safety issue there, too.
There was a safety issue, absolutely. And yet, the way the company dealt with it made it seem as if they weren't taking it seriously. And that was a big problem, I thought. And I think the brand took a bit of a hit for that.
Oh, definitely. I think if you look at the speed issue, coming out, being transparent, putting all of the cards on the table, taking responsibility. I mean, in Japan, the quality of a product and how a company stands behind it if something goes wrong is really important here. And for a Japanese company in particular, not to master this paradox of transparency. Very ironic. But
it's also very complex, I think. I mean, and I think if Sony had come out and said, look, we've got operations in hundreds of companies, over 100 countries. In order to recall all those batteries and actually exchange them, that's going to take weeks, if not months.
Yeah.
It's also a matter of finding out who has what batteries, because there were only certain batteries that needed to be recalled. So it was a very complex issue, and if they had spelled that out to journalists, to the public, I think they would have gotten a lot more sympathy than they got ultimately. They got beaten up by the media.
Well, and with reason and justly, because they basically tried to hide the problem, weren't disclosing information proactively.
Yeah.
So why should people trust them if they're trying to not be transparent? But this is an excellent case study, actually, that you've raised, because that story, of course, came in the first place from the posting of a photograph on Gizmodo.com, where there was a picture of the exploding Dell notebook.
Very dramatic.
And then 7 days later, USA Today picked it up, and all of a sudden, this blog fed the mainstream media.
Yeah.
Do you think that's happening a lot these days?
I think it's happening a lot more than most people think it is.
Oh, is that right?
Our job is changing in that way, in that we don't just go to press conferences or interview execs. A lot of the news cycle is now dictated by what happens in the cyber world. What happens in the blogosphere. You'd be surprised how much I read blogs these days. It's a great resource. It's a great place to find people who know, who are actually dealing with the tech or dealing with the video games, or I cover tech and science mostly.
Right.
And so, that a lot of people who deal with the products in my world are online.
Right.
It makes for quicker turnaround in stories. It's also, everything is so global now. A lot of times I'll do stories entirely via email and over the phone. It's not about going out and meeting these people. And that raises an ethical question. What do we really know that this person is out there and that this person is legitimately talking about a certain product? It's kind of a catch-22.
Well, that's one of the great questions right now. I mean, you have professional credentials. You work for a respected news outlet. You have credibility. A blogger may know something. Maybe there's a smoking gun inside of a company if it's a disgruntled employee, or maybe they're covering something up, but they aren't credentialed. And in Japan, many times the bloggers are anonymous, or they have an avatar, not a verifiable identity.
Right.
So it's a different situation culturally, isn't it?
Yeah, in Japan, bloggers tend to like to remain anonymous. I remember doing a story about how cell phone traders were affecting the stock market.
Yes.
Trying to find someone who'll speak, about his or her personal life here in Japan is very difficult. It's even more difficult online.
Right.
I mean, I've tried to go out on street corners and randomly, get vox pop
Right.
from folks on the street. I would say for every hour I'm out there, I might get one person who'll give me his name and age and occupation. Otherwise, most people would rather remain anonymous. It's the same online, I think. You're seeing plenty of blogs out there by knowledgeable people who don't want to be identified. And even though they're an expert in the field, they still don't want to be identified. That stands, I think, in stark contrast to what you see a lot in the U.S., where experts will actually have their own blogs. It's a way of facilitating a dialogue with the public and with others in their field.
It's true, and there's a different motivation there. We did a poll with Technorati of bloggers here in Japan and in America. And we found that the American blogger blogged primarily to be seen to be an expert or an authority in a certain area. The Japanese blogger, their motivation was different. It was more like, I want to create a record of my thoughts and share my thoughts with other people. Far more we, not so much a me or I, like the American blogger.
Right. Yeah, I think that's very true.
And you blog?
I do. It's difficult to fit it in because we're constantly running from one story to the next. It's a great way to dump thoughts or notes from a notebook.
Right.
That said, I think there are a lot of ways that you can approach a blog. I have two general approaches. One is that I will, if I think a story isn't quite worthy of the magazine or even the online version, I'll write it up as I would. I used to work at a Wire, so I'll write it up as I would a Wire story, and then I'll post it on the blog. Another way, obviously, a lot of people use the blog to simply point things out on the web. I saw this the other day. People are talking about that. Check it out. That's another kind of good way to drive traffic through the site, I think. Originally our blog started because our bosses wanted us to point out our own stories.
Right.
I wrote the other day about bioplastics. Somebody came back to me and said, look, they're using bioplastics in car wires, and that's why, vermin are chewing through car wires. And, to be honest...
Go figure.
He raises a good point, but it's actually not true at all. So, it's a way of, I guess, engaging readers, head on. So, that's just another way of using the blog.
How long have you been in Japan now?
9 years.
9 years. And how was the media bit? How was the life of the foreign correspondent, which sounds so mysterious and alluring? How was that different?
Not mysterious and alluring.
No?
And not glamorous, but I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, how is it different than working in America as a media, as a journalist?
I think it's much more difficult to sell your ideas for stories. And I say that because I think the U.S. public, at least, has a limited attention span for stories that are, that originate from overseas. I think you have to tell them why this is important to them. And that's a very difficult job to do. We're a filter, basically. We're also a cultural interpreter.